Let me just start with talking about two events, recent events. The first, of course, were Mr. Soros's lectures at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences and the Central European University. And the theme of his lectures were reflexivity of markets and the open society on the other. And the thing I think that stood out from his presentation was that really there's a problem with economics. And there's a problem with this. But I'll continue nevertheless. The first is a couple of phenomena. The first is this concept that humans are rational human beings. And the second is this thing called the efficient market hypothesis. And Mr. Soros went into considerable depth to develop his own model of reflexivity, which I'll refer to throughout my presentation today. The second event was when the sovereign of my nation, Queen Elizabeth, attended a meeting at the London School of Economics with Britain's most eminent economists. I will not name names because it could be libelous or slanderous. And she very wisely asked the question, why didn't you predict this crisis? And of course the economists in the room were then in trouble, of course, because you see there they were, Britain's leading economists, and not simply knowing what to say. I actually have a copy of the letter that they wrote to the Queen, and I'll read you a couple of extracts from what they said as we move along. Now, I think in many ways I'm in a unique position here to talk about why I think economics is in trouble. And that's because I actually have 3 degrees in economics, bachelor's, master's and PhD. But I'm what I would call a recovering economist. I have problems with the discipline, and I intend to outline why I think there is a problem. And so it was extremely refreshing to hear from a billionaire, one of the world's most leading practitioner thinkers, that basically neoclassical economics has got it wrong. And the associated neoliberal market fundamentalist ideology are causing problems for our society. Now you see, I always had suspicions that the assumptions underpinning neoclassical economics were wrong, but it was extremely refreshing to hear from somebody who had made their money as successfully as they had in the markets, that they actually recognized it themselves. However, growing up intellectually, I was in economics department, so I was kind of dragged in certain directions. The discipline was policed very much by a group of economists with very, very clear ideas. I escaped. And the first thing I did is I went to the United States as a doctoral fellow, and I joined a department of political science. And I had a mentor there who was a scholar of Japanese political economy. And he continuously told me, listen, Yusuf, you've got to get beyond these assumptions you're building in your models, because the moment you test your models, they fail abysmally. And he was a considerable influence on me, and was one of the main reasons why I chose to join a business school rather than joining an economics faculty. I also joined a business school because the salaries, of course, are much higher in business schools than they are in political science faculties. But joining the business school was extremely refreshing for me, because I finally managed to meet non-economists, sociologists, management scholars, and so forth. And they really gave me some very interesting new ideas to think about. And the more I think about the problem with economics is, I think there are 2 main reasons. The first, I think, is a fundamental intellectual one, which I'll come to in a moment. And the other one is a slightly more sinister political one. So let's deal first with the intellectual one. There's a physicist, an engineer, an economist on a desert island. And they've only got 1 can of beans left, but they don't have a tin opener. So the physicist says, well, this is very simple, obviously. What you do is you climb up into that tree over there, and you drop a stone on it, on the can. And of course, gravity and impact will open up the can of beans, and we'll be able to eat what's the last bit of food we have. The engineer, of course, looks at the physicist with typical sort of disdain and says, well, you've obviously completely missed the point, because if you drop a rock, there's no way you can control the impact of the rock onto the beans, in which case you could get more sand than beans once the can is knocked over. So what you actually really need to do is you actually need to get a system of pulleys and levers where you drop the rock onto the can of beans at the right speed and direction, and you open up the can without damaging the beans inside or getting sand on them. And then there's the economists sitting by themselves in the corner of the room on the island, looking at themselves and laughing. And they turn around to the economist and say, what's the problem? What are you laughing about? And the economist says, what we do in economics is we assume a tin opener. And I think that's fundamentally the problem, in the sense that economics as a discipline, academic economics, has basically got to a point where the models are more important than the reality that they're trying to reflect. A little bit like Marcel Proust shutting himself away and writing about the world outside without looking outside the window. And if you think about today's economics, it's a far cry from the fundamental basis of the subject, which is the so-called classical political economy of Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. I think if David Ricardo was to see some of the things that we get up to in economics today, I think he would be rather disappointed. And the second reason, I think, and this is a more sinister one, is that this market fundamentalism that Mr. Soros refers to, this belief in efficient markets, serves a very useful political purpose. It allows the restructuring of societies that favours a certain group within it. If you just look, for example, at the massive increase in income inequalities in the last 20 to 30 years, many of the results of these economic policies can be attributed to the failure of economics as a discipline. And again, I think it's worth noting that there are two very prominent American investors, Mr. Soros himself and Warren Buffett, who have both stated that we can only cut taxes so far, because if we keep cutting taxes, we create an unfair society. So, as Mr. Soros is suggesting, and I'm saying, economics and finance are more or less intellectually bankrupt as disciplines. You can quote me on that. They just don't make sense in the real world. So you may get tenure at a Department of Economics by publishing in the American Economic Review or the Journal of Finance, but your work will be read by very few people outside of the academy and will be of very limited application. So, to summarize, we have a crisis in the discipline. This brings me to two related ideas that I've taken from working with colleagues in faculties of management and organizational behavior. The bizarre thing is that if you're a scholar of organizational behavior, you've recognized all along, number one, that markets are fundamentally inefficient, and number two, that humans are fundamentally irrational. So it's rather strange, and maybe we can discuss this, why economists aren't listening. For example, we can go back to a book written in 1983 that my colleague, Professor Rod Martin, led me to, called The Permanently Failing Organization. And in this book, Meyer and Zucker argue that since organizations are not efficient, and since they're made up of idiosyncratic human beings, it's obvious, therefore, that we will see institutions persisting even though they don't work very well. For example, let's take a look at this region 20 years after the changes. Now, if you had believed Jeffrey Sachs's paper in 1988, just before he got hired as a consultant to the Polish government, you would have believed that if you liberalize markets, liberalize prices, free trade, free investment, you would have a functioning market economy. But I put it to you, go to Moscow, go to Kiev, go to Bucharest, go to Budapest, and you'll see something rather different. You'll see that, in fact, that 20 years on, we still have fundamentally imperfect markets. We have very corrupt institutions, both public and private. And perhaps from a management perspective, even more distressing, is we have institutions, private institutions, companies that continue to exist even though they're not very good at what they say they're trying to do. So I think the future of economics and finance within business education has to require economists and finance professors to give up their simplistic assumptions about humans are motivated and how markets function. And I think that the move towards behavioral finance and economics is a step in the right direction. And I think Mr. Soros' decision to launch a new institute devoted to the development of new economic ideas is clearly an important investment in the future intellectual development of the discipline. But I still have my doubts about economics as a recovering economist. And the problem lies that economists want to quantify everything. And I think that since human beings are fundamentally irrational and therefore fundamentally subjective, it's very hard to quantify subjectivity. So as a final thought, I think instead of giving Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations to economics students, I think we should consider giving them his other great work, which was A Theory of Moral Sentiment. Now, this may be very unsettling for both market fundamentalists and academic economists, but I think the time is ripe for a return, and I say return because I think business schools have been doing this for a long time, a return to sociological approaches to understanding markets and private institutions. And as I said, faculties of management have been doing so for a very long time. Thank you very much.